Frank Dalton sat in his darkened kitchen, the only sound the soft creak of his old wooden chair and the distant hum of cicadas outside his window. The power had gone out again, third time this month, and with it, so had the steady hum of his fridge and the soft glow of the old lamp he kept on the counter. In the silence, he felt it, that creeping sense that the world had moved on without him, that he was simply unplugged. It was funny, in a cruel way. A man who had spent 40 years wiring homes, restoring current to lifeless buildings, now couldn't keep the lights on in his own house. He wrapped his flannel shirt tighter around his thin frame and glanced at the analog clock on the wall. 7:42 p.m. Early, but already dark. Power outages always made time feel slower, heavier, like the hours refused to move unless lit by bulbs or buzzing screens. In the soft gloom, Frank's eyes drifted to the small tablet on the kitchen table. It hadn't been touched in weeks, maybe longer, but the last of its batteries still pulsed with life. He reached for it with a grunt, joints stiff like rusted hinges, and tapped the screen. A notification flickered to life: Elon Musk unveils new Tesla battery grid, bringing energy independence to forgotten towns. The headline hovered on the screen like a challenge. Frank stared at it, then tapped the video. The screen showed Elon standing under a wide western sky, framed by rows of gleaming batteries stretching across a once dusty field. Energy is stored potential, Elon said, his voice calm, certain. It's not about age, or place. It's about possibility. If you can still breathe, you can still build. Frank blinked. Something in that line hit him harder than he expected. Not just the words, but the quiet conviction in them, as if the man were speaking directly to him through the screen. He set the tablet down, but the words stayed with him, echoing between the silence and the shadows. If you can still breathe, you can still build. Outside, the wind picked up and rattled the loose paneling on the side of the house. Frank's fingers instinctively reached for the old flashlight in the drawer beside him. He clicked it on and walked through the hallway, passing the picture frames he no longer dusted. His daughter's graduation photo, his wedding portrait with Linda, the summer cabin up in Wisconsin, all frozen moments of a life that used to pulse with motion. He paused at the doorway to his garage. It smelled like old rubber, oil, and faint regret. The kind of regret that never yelled, just lingered like dust. He stepped inside and flicked on the flashlight. The beam landed on a rusted toolbox, some unused PVC pipe, and a stack of yellowing notebooks. Somewhere under all that, buried deep, was the prototype he never finished. 30 years ago, maybe more, he tried to design a home battery system that could store solar energy. He called it the pocket grid. Back then, it had seemed possible. Before Linda got sick, before his daughter left for college and then never quite came back. He'd abandoned it all: plans, ambition, belief. Now here he was, 72 years old, standing in a room that smelled like failure. But Elon's voice kept echoing. If you can still breathe, you can still build. Frank turned off the flashlight and walked back to the kitchen. The room was still dark, but something felt charged. He sat back down at the table, reopened the tablet, and watched the rest of the video. Musk talked about how entire communities were being revived by stored energy. Places no one cared about anymore were powering up, not from massive grid lines, but from localized systems. Innovation doesn't age, Elon said, as if daring the camera to disagree. Frank chuckled, a dry, dusty sound that surprised even him. Innovation doesn't age. He looked at his hands, wrinkled, veined, but still steady. Could it really be that simple? Could something left behind still be restarted? He wasn't sure. But for the first time in years, he wasn't entirely sure it couldn't. His phone buzzed once. A message from his daughter: "Hey Dad, heard about the outage. You okay?" No emojis, no call. Just enough to check a box. He stared at it for a moment, then typed back, still breathing. He didn't press send. Not yet. He set the phone down and looked out the window. The stars were clearer tonight, the lack of light pollution making them brighter. Maybe that was the only upside of being forgotten, you got to see the sky. His thoughts drifted back to when he was 16, standing beside his father in the basement, helping him wire a fuse box. Electricity's like belief, his dad had said. You don't need to see it. You just need to know it's there, waiting. Frank hadn't thought of that memory in decades, but now it struck him like a live wire. Waiting. That's what he'd been doing, wasn't it? Waiting for someone to say he still mattered. Waiting for permission to start again. Waiting for a sign. Maybe this was it. Not the video, or the outage, or the silence, but the combination of all three. A whisper in the dark saying, try. Just once more. He got up again and, without knowing exactly why, pulled the old notebooks out from the garage shelf. Dust flew into the air, catching the moonlight like fireflies. He coughed, then opened the cover. Page after page of pencil sketches, formulas, notes from a version of himself who still believed in possibilities. On the inside cover, he'd taped a clipping of an old news article about Elon starting Zip2, proof that vision could come from anywhere. He didn't know if it would work. He didn't even know if he had the parts anymore. But the idea still had voltage. And that meant maybe he did, too. Frank sat down, grabbed a sharpened pencil from the junk drawer, and drew a new line over an old blueprint. He didn't notice the power come back on. The fridge hummed to life again, and the counter lamp blinked on behind him. But he didn't look up. Because something else had already switched on. Deep inside, something flickered. Not just memory, not just regret. Possibility. He hadn't felt it in so long, he barely recognized it. But now that it was here, it felt like coming home. He picked up his phone again and looked at the unsent text. This time, he added one more word. Still breathing. Building something. Then he hit send. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The morning after the power came back, Frank Dalton sat at the edge of his bed staring at his slippers like they were some kind of riddle he couldn't quite solve. His bones felt brittle in the early light, and the stiffness in his back warned him against rushing anything. The clock on the nightstand read 6:12 a.m., the same time it always read when he woke up, out of habit, not desire. No alarm needed. His body was its own kind of timer now, finely tuned to the slow rhythm of retirement, of stillness, of the days where nothing waited and no one expected anything. He finally slipped the slippers on and shuffled to the bathroom, catching a glimpse of himself in the mirror as he turned on the tap. The man staring back didn't look surprised anymore. The gray had settled in his beard like dust in old attic corners, and the skin beneath his eyes sagged like tired curtains. There were lines etched deep into his forehead, not from laughter, but from thinking too much about things he couldn't change. He brushed his teeth, more out of duty than freshness, and padded toward the kitchen. The smell of burnt coffee grounds still lingered in the air from yesterday. He never brewed a full pot anymore, just one cup, watered down, lukewarm. Linda used to make it strong, said life was too short for weak coffee. That thought brought a soft ache to his chest. He still kept her favorite mug on the rack, a chipped yellow thing with a faded smiley face on one side. He never used it. Just liked seeing it there, like a little piece of her hadn't left. The TV remote sat on the counter next to the unopened mail. He clicked the news on out of routine. More headlines about the world spinning forward at breakneck speed. Battery innovations, AI breakthroughs, rockets launching, young faces with bright eyes talking about changing everything. Frank just stood there, holding a cup that barely steamed, wondering when exactly he'd stopped being part of all this motion. He wasn't bitter, not really. He didn't envy them. He just felt unplugged. Like an old appliance still in the room but no longer in use. He used to be sharp, quick with his hands, nimble with numbers. A licensed electrician, in high demand during the 80s and 90s. There wasn't a breaker box in town he couldn't handle, no flickering light fixture he couldn't fix. He'd started his own company, Dalton Electric, in 1985. Just a two-man operation at first, him and Ray Culver, his best friends since high school. They wired up new homes, repaired old ones, and even did a few industrial jobs out by the grain mill. For a while, it felt like they were building something lasting. But then Ray moved south, chasing warmer winters. The town started to shrink, young folks leaving, factories closing. The calls slowed. Retirement came not as a decision, but a drift. One day he just didn't get any more calls, and he stopped checking the business phone. It gathered dust next to the yellow mug. The hardest part wasn't the stillness, it was the quietness inside. There were entire days when he didn't speak to another human being. Weeks when his only interaction was a grocery clerk's mumbled, "Have a good one." He used to joke with Linda that she was his antenna. Always pulling him into conversations, neighbors, church potlucks. After she passed, the antenna broke. The signal went dead. He tried church a few times after that, but the pews were thinner and the sermons longer, and everyone just looked tired. He'd go to the senior center now and then, but the conversations there were all the same, prescriptions, joints, memories half remembered. He didn't want to talk about the past like it was the only thing left. What he really missed was the feeling of forward motion. Of working on something that might lead somewhere. That used to live in the garage, the space where dreams were allowed to take up real space. He hadn't stepped back in there for more than a minute in years until last night, when the dark pressed in and Musk's voice broke through it. If you can still breathe, you can still build. Frank had built a lot of things in his life, fuses, friendships, even a family. But nothing felt finished. Especially not the battery project. That one stung the most. He'd come up with the idea sometime in the early 90s, when solar panels were still considered novelty items. He saw where the future was going, even then, thought maybe a small, modular energy storage unit could be the missing piece for rural homes. Called it pocket grid because it was meant to be portable and personal, like keeping your own bit of the sun in your back pocket. He'd built a crude prototype, used car batteries, salvaged solar cells, copper wiring. Linda helped him assemble the first casing. They even pitched the idea once to a small tech firm in St. Louis, but the meeting went sideways. Too experimental, they said. Too old-fashioned. Frank didn't argue. He just packed up the demo and drove home in silence. Then life took over, Linda's diagnosis, medical bills, selling the business. Dreams got boxed up with the tax returns and Christmas decorations. And now? Now he couldn't even remember half the schematics. But the memory had been stirred. It was like a circuit had closed again. Just faintly, like a filament glowing on the edge of burnout. He looked over at the garage door from the kitchen table, then back at the tablet, still charging from last night. Another headline popped up in the corner of the screen, rural Illinois town now fully powered by Tesla grid battery network. That wasn't far. Less than 100 miles south. Towns like that weren't supposed to matter anymore. But they were lighting up again. Not from handouts. From innovation. From belief. Frank chewed on that. Belief. He wasn't sure when he'd lost his. Maybe the day the doctor called. Maybe the night Linda didn't wake up. Maybe it was slower than that, like a slow leak in a tire. By the time you realize you're deflated, it's already too late. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't. He stood up suddenly, almost knocking over his cup. His knees popped in protest. He walked to the hall closet and pulled out a small plastic bin labeled junk. Inside, beneath old remotes and tangled cords, was a leather-bound notebook. He hadn't seen it in at least 15 years. The spine cracked as he opened it. Diagrams. Notes. Lists of materials. A few faded photographs taped inside, one of a workbench covered in wires, another of Linda smiling beside a model battery box the size of a toolbox. And tucked in the back, folded in quarters, was the old patent application. Never filed. Frank ran a finger across the edge of the page. His heart was thudding faster now, not from fear but from recognition. Like remembering the name of a song you hadn't heard in decades. He carried the notebook to the kitchen table, laid it beside the tablet. A side-by-side of the past and the present. He didn't know what he could do yet. He didn't have the same strength, the same drive. But maybe he had something else now, time. And maybe the world had caught up to the vision he'd once buried. Maybe it wasn't obsolete. Maybe he wasn't obsolete. He flipped to a blank page and picked up a pen. The ink took a second to start flowing, like it too had grown stiff with age. He began sketching, just rough outlines, boxes, lines connecting them. His hands trembled at first, but settled with each mark. Something was coming back to him. Not just memory. Purpose. He worked for an hour, maybe more, until his back ached and the room filled with morning light. The phone rang once. He let it go to voicemail. It was probably someone selling insurance or vitamins. He didn't care. For the first time in a long time, Frank Dalton had somewhere to be. And that somewhere was here. Right at his kitchen table, with a pen, a notebook, and a dream that had waited far too long in the dark. It was Thursday morning when Frank finally stepped outside with a purpose that wasn't grocery shopping or checking the mail, and as soon as he opened the screen door, the warm August air wrapped around him like a heavy old quilt he hadn't asked for. The sun was already too high for comfort, casting long shadows from the brittle trees along the street, and the grass, half dead from weeks without rain, crunched beneath his sneakers as he made his way down the front steps. He held the notebook in one hand and a folded list in the other. A parts list scribbled in ballpoint pen the night before, rewritten 3 times until it looked clean enough to not embarrass him. It had been years since he set foot in the hardware store, but the old Dalton pride told him he could still walk in there like he knew what he was doing, even if half the inventory had probably gone digital or disappeared altogether. As he drove through the town square, past shuttered storefronts and crooked for sale signs, a familiar ache settled in his chest, not from his heart but from memory. This place used to be something. On Saturdays, the streets buzzed with farmers' markets and teenagers washing cars for church trips. Linda used to sell her canned peaches by the gazebo while Frank handed out flyers for Dalton Electric. Now, the gazebo was rotting, and the only thing being handed out was silence. He pulled into the faded parking lot of Carter's Hardware, relieved to see it was still open, barely. The bell above the door gave a weak ring as he stepped inside, and the coolness of the air conditioning hit him like a gift. The place smelled the same, sawdust, motor oil, rubber. For a moment, he felt 30 again. Then a young man behind the counter looked up from his phone, chewed something, and barely nodded before returning to scrolling. Frank wandered the aisles slowly, scanning the shelves, muttering under his breath. 12-gauge wire, battery clamps, solder. He spotted a bin of copper coil and reached in to test the weight, when a voice behind him broke the moment. "Need help finding something, sir?" Frank turned to see a girl in her 20s wearing a Carter's vest and a tired expression. He showed her the list without saying much. She looked it over, nodded, and began guiding him through the aisles. She was quick, efficient, and didn't ask questions until they reached the checkout. "You building something?" she asked, more from obligation than curiosity. Frank hesitated, then said, "Trying to finish something I started a long time ago." She gave a polite half-smile and rang him up. As he swiped his debit card, he caught his reflection in the security mirror above the counter. His posture sagged, his baseball cap too big on his thinning hair, his hands spotted with age. He suddenly saw what the world must see, an old man with a hobby, clinging to some rusted dream. On the way out, the young man behind the counter muttered something Frank didn't catch. He turned back. What was that? The kid smirked. Nothing. Just, cool that you're still, tinkering and stuff. It wasn't cruel, not exactly. But it was condescending in the way only the young can manage without meaning to be. Frank forced a smile and left. As he drove home, his hands clenched the wheel tighter than they needed to. Still tinkering and stuff. The words echoed in his mind, rubbing salt in an old wound. He remembered when people used to ask for his opinion. When his phone rang off the hook every week. When city inspectors gave him nods of respect. Now he was just a man buying wires for a forgotten project, and no one believed it would be anything more than a way to kill time. Back home, he spread the materials across his workbench in the garage, dust swirling in the shafts of light cutting through the small window. The notebook lay open beside him, pages creased from years of waiting. He laid out the components like puzzle pieces, trying to reassemble a vision from 3 decades ago. But his fingers fumbled. The soldering iron didn't heat like it used to. The wires wouldn't hold. Sweat dripped from his brow onto the blueprints. Twice he cursed aloud, loud enough for the dog next door to bark. He sat back and stared at the mess he'd made. What was he even doing? He didn't have the stamina, the eyesight, the steady hands. He didn't have investors, or a garage full of interns, or media platforms to share it with. He wasn't part of this world anymore. He was a VHS tape in a streaming age. Still breathing, sure, but was that enough? That night, he didn't eat dinner. Just sat on the porch with the lights off, watching the town flicker faintly in the distance. A couple of porch lights across the street blinked out, probably motion sensors on the fritz. He used to fix those for the neighbors. They didn't ask anymore. Nobody wanted to bother the old guy. A car drove by slowly, windows rolled up, bass thumping. Frank didn't even turn to look. He stared up at the stars again, the same ones from last night, and felt the quiet press in around him. Was it foolish to try? Was he just making a spectacle of himself? His daughter, Marie, hadn't responded to his last text. Not even a thumbs up. He hadn't seen her in person in 6 months. She called sometimes, always when she was driving, her voice full of background noise and, "Sorry Dad, can you hold on one sec?" He didn't blame her. Life was busy. And what could he offer her now, anyway? Just another parent to check on, another box on a to-do list. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through her old messages, reading between the lines of every, "Hope you're doing okay." There was distance there. Not just miles, years, maybe lifetimes. When she was little, she used to sit in the garage with him, legs swinging off the workbench, watching him twist wires and test voltages. "You're like a magician, Daddy," she'd say, eyes wide. Somewhere along the way, the magic wore off. He put the phone away and stood slowly, joints aching in silent protest. He walked back into the garage, not to fix anything, just to look. The battery casing sat on the bench, lopsided, unfinished. He traced a finger along its edge. It didn't matter if no one else believed in this. Not right now. What mattered was that he did. Even if the world thought he was too old to matter, even if he failed in silence, he needed to try. Because trying felt like breathing. The next morning, he drove to the senior center for the free blood pressure screening. Nurse Helen greeted him with her usual cheer. "Good to see you out and about, Frank. Still keeping busy?" He gave a noncommittal grunt. In the waiting room, he sat across from Hank and Lou, 2 men he used to bowl with. They were swapping stories about medications and grandkids and how their knees couldn't handle stairs anymore. Lou looked over. "You still fixing stuff out in that garage of yours?" Frank nodded. "Trying to finish something I started a long time ago." Hank chuckled. "At our age, finishing breakfast is enough of a project." They laughed. Frank smiled politely but didn't join in. They didn't mean harm. But it was the same message, repeated in softer tones: this part of life is for winding down, not starting up. No one expects anything new from you. You're past tense. He left early. On the way home, he passed by the high school football field where weeds now curled through the bleachers. At a stoplight, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the rearview mirror. He didn't feel old. Not in the soul. Just, uninvited. Like the world was throwing a party and forgot to send him the address. But last night, when he'd heard Elon talk about possibility, something had cracked open. Something real. Elon wasn't selling retirement. He was selling fire. And Frank wasn't ready to stop burning. Back in the garage, he plugged in the soldering iron again. Hands still shaky, but steadier than yesterday. He picked up the battery casing, exhaled slowly, and started again. The sun was already high when Frank Dalton wiped the sweat from his forehead and squinted into the humming glow of his garage, the makeshift lab that now looked more like a battlefield, tools scattered across the bench, scraps of wire tangled like weeds, and the stubborn battery casing still sitting there, daring him to finish it. He hadn't slept much the night before, not because of pain or dreams, but because his mind wouldn't stop racing. The numbers, the old formulas, the way current needed a place to flow, it was all coming back like a language he hadn't spoken in years but somehow still remembered in his bones. He'd woken before dawn and made coffee so strong it could peel paint, then gone straight to the garage, determined to keep the momentum alive before it slipped away. The soldering iron was working again, finally heating properly after he replaced the frayed cord, and his hands, while still stiff, had begun to remember the rhythm of precision. He was halfway through reconnecting a section of copper braid when the voice on his old radio caught his attention. Tesla announced today that its rural battery pilot program is expanding to over 60 counties across the Midwest, including regions once considered unreachable by the national grid. Frank paused, the smell of hot solder in the air, his pulse ticking up. That word again, rural. Forgotten towns. Places like his. He turned up the volume, the radio crackling with static but still clear enough to hear Elon Musk's voice cut through. "We're not just lighting up cities," Elon said, calm but urgent. "We're giving power to the places America forgot. We're building energy independence, one community at a time." Frank stood frozen, staring at the battery box like it had just blinked at him. That voice, it wasn't just marketing. It felt like a call. Not to everyone. To him. He shut off the iron, wiped his hands on an old towel, and went back inside. His tablet sat on the kitchen table, still open to a paused video of Musk walking through a solar farm somewhere in Texas. Frank hit play. Elon's face filled the screen, sun behind him, his tone unshakable. "We don't move forward by waiting for someone else to fix it. We fix it ourselves. That's the American way. You've got to be bold enough to be wrong, or you'll never be right." Frank leaned forward, elbows on the table. He didn't know what it was exactly, maybe the fire in Elon's eyes, maybe the fact that someone still dared to believe in rebuilding from the edges, but something in that moment made him sit back in his chair and ask the question he hadn't dared ask out loud. What if I'm not too late? What if this is my time? Not 30 years ago. Now. He clicked over to a video on small-scale battery design. Then another. Then another. Hours passed. He took notes, filled pages of his notebook with updated wiring schemes and energy calculations. The technology had advanced, but the principles were still the same. What had once seemed out of reach now felt possible. He hadn't felt this alive since the day Marie was born. That night, he didn't turn on the lights in the house, just sat in the dark, watching the faint glow of the garage window as the prototype battery system hummed to life under the dim beam of his workbench lamp. It wasn't perfect. Not yet. But it was working. It was storing energy. It was breathing. The next morning, he drove across town to the library, the only place with free, reliable Wi-Fi and a scanner that hadn't been removed during budget cuts. The librarian, a quiet woman named Denise who always smelled like lavender, looked up as he entered. "Well, look who the wind blew in," she said gently. "Haven't seen you in a while, Mr. Dalton." "Working on something," Frank replied. She raised an eyebrow. "You always are." He smiled at that. He headed to the tech table in the back, pulled out his notebook, and began scanning in the diagrams, page by page, feeding them through the scanner with hands that felt more sure today than they had in months. He created a folder labeled Pocket Grid Rev 2 and saved the files. Then he sat back and stared at the screen. For the first time, it felt real. Not a relic. Not a memory. A plan. He opened a new email draft, addressed it to no one in particular, and saved it. Not yet. Not today. But soon. On the way home, he stopped by the gas station for a cold drink. At the counter, a teenager was watching something on his phone and laughing. Frank glanced down, an Elon Musk interview from years ago. The teen looked up, noticed him watching, and smirked. "You know who that is, right?" Frank nodded. "Yeah. I've been listening to him too." The kid laughed. "He's kinda nuts, right?" "Yeah," Frank said. "The good kind." Back home, the garage felt different. Like something sacred. He sat at the bench and picked up where he left off, refining the voltage regulator, adding heat shielding, testing current flow through the battery cell. He was meticulous, stubborn, methodical. When he made a mistake, he didn't curse or quit. He adjusted. He adapted. He worked late into the night, stopping only when his back screamed for mercy. He plugged in a small LED light to the battery system. When it lit up without a flicker, something shifted in his chest. It wasn't much, a light no brighter than a candle. But it was powered by his own system. His own vision. That meant something. He took a picture of it with his tablet, not to share, just to remember. The next day, Frank called an old friend, Jerry from the town council. They hadn't talked in years, but Jerry still picked up on the second ring. "Frank? Well, I'll be damned. What's the occasion?" Frank took a breath. "You still got that list of properties the town was trying to sell off? Old municipal lots?" "Sure. Why?" "I want to test something. I've got a working prototype of a personal battery system. Could be useful for off-grid homes, or emergency shelters. Might be nothing. But I think it might be something." Silence on the line. Then, "You still playing around with that project of yours?" "No," Frank said, firm. "I'm building it." Jerry paused. "Well, shoot. That's good to hear." They talked for a while. Frank explained what he'd been doing. Jerry offered to connect him with someone from the state's Clean Energy Task Force. Nothing guaranteed, but worth a shot. Frank hung up and sat in the garage with the notebook in his lap, heart pounding. It was happening. Slowly, clumsily, but happening. A week passed in a blur of testing, tweaking, phone calls, and more hours on YouTube than he cared to admit. He reconnected with an old apprentice, Mason, now a solar tech working out west. They spoke over video. Mason's eyes lit up when Frank showed him the pocket grid. "This is amazing, Frank," he said. "You realize how far ahead of your time this was? We're just starting to do this kind of modular storage." Frank smiled. "I was just a little early, that's all." Mason offered to help him digitize the system, build a model in CAD, and maybe even share it on his tech blog. Frank wasn't ready for that. Not yet. But soon. One morning, while eating toast too dry to enjoy but too filling to skip, Frank opened the Tesla website and found the contact page for community energy proposals. It felt absurd, like shouting into the wind. But he filled out the form, attached his schematic scans, and wrote a simple message: "My name is Frank Dalton. I'm a retired electrician from Illinois. 30 years ago, I designed a personal battery storage unit for rural homes. I gave up on it when life got in the way. But I've rebuilt it, and I believe it's something that could help. I'm not looking for money. I'm just looking to matter." He hit send. Then he closed the tablet and sat back, hands trembling, not from age this time, but from adrenaline. He'd done it. He'd reached out. He didn't know if anyone would answer. But he'd stopped waiting. That night, when the garage light buzzed on again and the pocket grid hummed quietly on the bench, Frank sat beside it in a folding chair, staring at it like a fire he'd built in the wilderness. He didn't know what would come next. But he wasn't unplugged anymore. He was reconnected. And this time, the power was his. 3 days passed with no reply. Frank checked the Tesla contact portal every morning, sometimes twice a day, refreshing the page like a man waiting for a message in a bottle to wash up on shore. Nothing. No email. No callback. Not even a confirmation that his submission had gone through. It was like he'd dropped his life's work into a canyon and was standing there listening for an echo that never came. He didn't tell anyone, not Mason, not Jerry, not Denise at the library, who had started asking more questions about his little science project. He didn't want sympathy. He didn't want the kind of encouragement that felt like pity. The kind that said, "It's good you're keeping busy," as if purpose was just a pastime to help pass the time until you passed away. He just kept working, tweaking the voltage stabilizer, improving the discharge cycle of the storage cells, watching the numbers get more precise even if the world didn't seem to notice. He started logging everything into spreadsheets, complete with timestamps and output readings, the kind of detail he used to be known for when Dalton Electric was still running strong. Even when things got frustrating, like when a capacitor blew out and scorched his only pair of decent reading glasses, he pressed on. But every day, as the sun dropped behind the low tree line and the garage dimmed, a voice would creep in and start whispering. "You're too late. Too small. You're not part of this world anymore." That night, as he sat watching the dim orange light flicker inside the pocket grid casing, he caught his reflection in the window glass and thought about something Marie had said to him months ago, over the phone. "Dad, I just worry you're not taking care of yourself. I don't want you spending all your time alone in that garage." At the time, he'd brushed it off. But now the words curled around his chest like wire, tightening slowly. Was he chasing something that didn't matter to anyone but him? Was he just afraid of being forgotten, so he built a machine to shout through the silence? The next morning brought another kind of resistance, the real-world kind. Frank was walking out of the hardware store, another bag of parts in hand, when he bumped into Earl Landry, an old customer who used to call Frank every winter when his heating unit acted up. Earl was a big guy, loud voice, full of opinions and short on tact. "Frank," he barked, giving him a once-over. "Heard you been messing with some kind of battery thing out at your place." Frank nodded slowly. "Just an old project I'm finishing." Earl grunted. "You trying to be one of those green energy types now?" He chuckled like it was a joke. "Next thing I know you'll be driving a damn spaceship." Frank managed a tight smile. "Just trying to make something useful." Earl wasn't listening. "Whole country's going soft. All this talk about solar and batteries and shutting down real power. It's a joke. Windmills don't keep your pipes from freezing." Frank started to walk away, but Earl called out, "Don't waste your retirement trying to fix what ain't broken." That one stuck. Not because Frank agreed, but because it reminded him that no matter how far he'd come, there would always be people rooted so deep in the past they couldn't see the future if it drove up and parked in their driveway. He drove home slower than usual, letting the winding backroads bleed the noise from his mind. But even back in the garage, the tension lingered. He looked at the prototype, humming quietly with potential, and realized he wasn't just fighting the silence anymore. He was fighting doubt, from the outside and from within. That afternoon, while testing the second array module, the system shorted. The LED blinked out. A faint burning smell filled the air. Frank stared at the panel, stunned. His notes had been right. The math was solid. But something had failed. And in that moment, all the air seemed to leave the room. He sat on the edge of a stool, head in his hands, wondering if this was the sign. The final wall. The whisper that said, "You gave it your best. Now let it go." He stayed there for a long time, the kind of stillness that feels like quitting without the ceremony. But then, almost on instinct, he reached for the notebook. Flipped back to a page from 29 years ago. A diagram he barely remembered drawing. And there it was, a resistor alignment he'd forgotten in the new version. It wasn't the system. It was him. He stood, slower this time, walked to the workbench, and began again. The hours passed unnoticed. He replaced the damaged components, rewired the converter, calibrated the output line, and when he flipped the switch again, the LED glowed brighter than before. He didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He just nodded, once. Like a man confirming something he already knew. The next day brought a letter in the mail, an actual letter, not an email. It was from the Illinois Clean Energy Initiative, forwarded through the town hall. They had received a recommendation from Jerry and wanted to know more about his design. No promises. No commitments. But interest. That was all Frank needed. He didn't call anyone. He didn't post about it. He just went to the garage, pulled up a folding chair, and stared at the pocket grid system with eyes that had seen too much to celebrate too soon. Still, that night, as he sat with a sandwich in his lap and the garage light casting warm shadows on the walls, he felt a quiet pride settle in his chest. Not loud. Not boastful. Just solid. Earned. It had taken resistance, real and emotional, to remind him that forward motion only matters when there's something pushing back. The next morning, Marie called. Her voice was calmer than usual, unhurried. "Hey, Dad. I saw something online about a community battery project. It reminded me of you." Frank hesitated. "I've been working on something." "I know," she said. "Uncle Jerry told me. Said you've been building again." There was a pause. "I think that's amazing." Frank blinked. He hadn't expected that. "I just didn't want to worry you," he said. Marie laughed gently. "Dad, I'm not worried. I'm proud. I just didn't know you still had that kind of fire." He smiled, though she couldn't see it. "It never really went out. Just got quiet for a while." They talked for almost an hour. Not just about the battery, but about Linda, about old times, about new things. Frank asked about her job, her apartment, the book she'd been writing but never finished. When he hung up, the garage felt a little warmer, even though the temperature hadn't changed. That night, Frank sat on the porch and looked out at the quiet street, thinking about all the versions of himself that had come and gone. The young electrician. The grieving husband. The retired man with too much time and not enough purpose. And now, something else. Not reborn. Not transformed. Just reconnected to the parts of himself that still worked. Still mattered. He didn't know if the world would ever see his invention the way he saw it. But he knew now that the act of building, of pushing through resistance, of daring to believe in the value of unfinished dreams, that was enough. The power wasn't in the battery. It was in the choice to keep trying. To stay in motion. To stand in the face of everything that said, too late, and say, not yet. And as the garage light flickered back on behind him, casting long, steady shadows on the pavement, Frank Dalton stood up, stretched his back, and walked toward it, one slow, determined step at a time. Frank didn't expect the email to come through at all, and when it did, it happened on a Tuesday, the kind of quiet, ordinary morning that usually passed without memory. He'd just sat down with a piece of burnt toast, flipping through a dog-eared manual on inverters, when the notification pinged on the tablet screen. At first, he thought it was another promotional ad or maybe a warning that his inbox was full again. But the subject line stopped him cold. Your energy submission, initial review complete. His heart skipped. He tapped the screen with more force than necessary, hands suddenly clammy, eyes straining. The message was short, almost sterile. Mr. Dalton, thank you for submitting your pocket grid design to the Tesla Rural Energy Initiative. Your proposal has passed the initial screening phase and has been referred to our Applied Innovation team for further technical review. A specialist will be reaching out to discuss your submission within the next 10 business days. We appreciate your vision for localized energy solutions. Sincerely, Applied Energy Review Team. That was it. No signature. No title. But the words were there. It had been seen. It was real. Frank sat in silence for a moment, toast growing cold in his hand. He read the email again, then again, like the words might change or disappear. They didn't. 10 business days. He did the math in his head, then did it again to make sure. It didn't matter how long it took. They were going to call. Or email. Or something. He stood slowly, walking to the garage like a man on a pilgrimage, and turned on the work light above the bench. The prototype stood there, quiet and sturdy, like it was waiting for its cue. For the first time, Frank noticed how neat everything looked. Not just organized, but prepared. The layout, the wiring, the digital logs. His system was ready. The question now was he? The next few days passed in a strange, almost holy rhythm. Frank woke up early, sometimes before dawn, and went straight to the garage. He cleaned every inch of the workspace, rewired the connections with fresh shielding, updated his schematics, and labeled everything down to the last resistor. He ordered a backup inverter just in case they wanted a demo. He even changed the old fluorescent tube that had been flickering above the door for months. If they were going to contact him, if someone from Tesla was going to see this, even just over a screen, he wanted to be ready. He kept it quiet. Not because he didn't trust anyone, but because he didn't want to lose the feeling. That electric hum under his skin. Like his blood was charged again. Every time the phone rang, his heart jumped. Every time the tablet lit up, he held his breath. Days passed. Then a week. On the 9th day, he started to doubt again. Maybe it had been a mistake. Maybe they'd moved on. Maybe some 27-year-old Stanford grad had submitted something flashier, and the review team had forgotten about the retired man in a forgotten town. On the 10th morning, just as he was pouring a second cup of coffee, the call came. Unknown number. California area code. Frank stared at the screen for a second too long, then answered with a voice steadier than he expected. Hello. A woman's voice responded, crisp and confident. Mr. Dalton, this is Ava Chen with the Tesla Applied Energy team. I'm calling about your pocket grid submission. Frank blinked. Yes. Yes, I'm here. She continued. First, I want to thank you for sharing your design. It's not often we get submissions that come with both practical schematics and a clear, tested prototype. I've reviewed your logs, your technical drawings, and I have to say, it's compelling. Frank didn't say anything for a moment. He didn't trust his voice. Ava went on. I have a few technical questions and then, if you're comfortable, I'd like to schedule a video meeting so I can see the prototype in real time. Frank cleared his throat. Of course. Ask anything you want. What followed was a half-hour conversation full of jargon, voltage curves, insulation tolerances, battery chemistry. Frank answered every question. Slowly, precisely. His voice grew stronger with each reply, confidence returning like muscle memory. Ava didn't rush him. She listened. She asked smart questions. She sounded young, maybe early 30s, but she didn't talk down to him. In fact, she seemed impressed. I have to say, it's rare to see a solution this elegant, she said at one point. You kept the design modular, which makes it scalable. That's exactly the kind of thinking we're trying to promote in low-grid regions. Frank smiled. It was designed for my town. People who don't have time for complexity. Just need the lights to stay on. By the end of the call, Ava was already setting a time for the video demo. Let's plan for Thursday, 2 p.m. Central. I'll send a Zoom link. Just make sure you have the system ready and a way to show the internal wiring. I'll be ready, Frank said. And he meant it. The moment the call ended, he let out a laugh, a real, full laugh that surprised even him. He felt 20 years younger. He could feel it all moving now, like a current just beneath the surface. The garage became his studio, his battleground, his altar. He rehearsed everything. Checked and double-checked the readings. Set up a makeshift stand for the tablet so he could show the system hands-free. On the morning of the call, he even ironed a shirt, first time in years. Marie called to check in. Big day, huh? Frank smiled into the phone. Yeah. I think so. I'm proud of you, Dad, she said. I don't say that enough. Frank swallowed hard. Thank you. At exactly 1:59 p.m., the Zoom link went live. Ava's face appeared on the screen, dark hair, sharp eyes, a quiet intensity. Beside her were two others, a man with glasses named Devin, who nodded politely, and a woman named Carla, who didn't speak much but seemed to be recording everything. Frank walked them through the system, the camera shaky at first but soon steady. He explained the concept, the original inspiration, the 30-year gap, and the resurrection. He showed them the live data. The discharge cycles. The compact housing. The output. When the LED array powered on at full strength, Ava actually smiled. That's clean, she said. And look at that consistency. Devin leaned in. Is that a dual-layer control board? Homemade, Frank said. I used existing parts. But it can scale. They asked a few more questions, thanked him, and said they'd be in touch after a full team review. The call ended. Silence returned. Frank stared at the blank screen for a moment, heart still pounding, then leaned back in his chair and exhaled like he'd just run a marathon. He didn't know what would come of it. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But he had shown up. And they had listened. That night, he sat outside under a wide, black sky full of stars and remembered how he used to lie next to Linda in this same spot, whispering dreams they were too young to think might fade. He smiled. Somewhere out there, energy was moving. And now, finally, so was he. The email came 4 days later, and it wasn't just from Ava this time. It had the Tesla logo, a formal letterhead, and a subject line that made Frank's chest tighten like a voltage spike. Next steps, Pocket Grid pilot proposal. He opened it with hands that shook, slowly reading every word, afraid to miss anything or let hope rise too quickly. Dear Mr. Dalton, following our recent video review and technical assessment, we're pleased to inform you that your Pocket Grid prototype has been selected for early-stage field integration. We would like to formally invite you to partner with Tesla's Rural Energy Innovation Task Force to begin pilot testing of your system in selected Illinois counties. This partnership will include on-site technical support, expanded design collaboration, and integration testing with existing solar and battery technologies. Please review the attached NDA and summary of expectations. Upon your acceptance, our engineering team will initiate Phase 1. He stopped reading, eyes wide, pulse hammering in his ears. This was real. It wasn't a pat on the back or a polite dismissal. This was an invitation to bring the Pocket Grid to life, at scale. He scrolled down, saw the signatures at the bottom: Ava Chen, Lead Innovation Strategist, Martin Costas, VP of Applied Energy Systems. He didn't recognize the second name, but the title told him everything. This wasn't just some intern giving him a gold star. This was from the top. He read the email twice more before standing up, pacing the kitchen like a man trying to walk it off. He didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or call someone, so he just muttered under his breath, "Damn, Linda, it's really happening." For a long minute he stood at the window, staring at the distant fields, golden with late summer light, and imagined them dotted with panels, each one connected to a pocket grid, each one powered by something he had built in a garage that used to collect dust and regret. He sat down, opened the documents, and started reading. The NDA was standard, lots of legalese about confidentiality, intellectual property, proprietary data, and field testing protocols. It took him a while to work through it, but it felt oddly satisfying, like suiting up for a game he thought he'd aged out of. He signed, scanned, and emailed it back. By evening, the reply came, "Welcome aboard, Mr. Dalton. We're excited to begin." Frank didn't sleep much that night. He didn't need to. His body was buzzing with a kind of energy he hadn't felt in decades. The next morning, he got to work. Tesla's team sent specs, CAD models, and integration schematics. They wanted to see how his system could function as a microgrid node in both on-grid and off-grid conditions. They didn't ask if he could handle it, they assumed he could. And so he did. For the next week, Frank was no longer a retiree or a widower tinkering with old dreams. He was a collaborator, a co-developer, a man on a mission. His garage became a war room, blueprints taped to walls, wires coiled neatly, diagrams layered in pencil and digital printouts. He set alarms to remind him to stretch, to eat, but often he ignored them. The work fed him more than food ever could. On Thursday, Ava called again, her tone brisk but warm. "Frank, we've got a field site about 40 miles west of you, small township outside Galesburg. Agricultural, low-grid reliability, mostly diesel generators and portable panels. It's the perfect place to test your system." "I know that area," he said. "Flat land. Lots of wind. They've had outages every summer for years." "Exactly," Ava replied. "We'd like to install a pocket grid there, your version, with one of our power walls to monitor compatibility. Are you up for it?" "Tell me where and when," he said without hesitation. The following Monday, Frank drove to the site with two engineers from the regional team, Gus and Elise, both in their 30s, both surprised that the designer of the pocket grid was riding shotgun with a beat-up cooler full of sandwiches and a socket set on his lap. Gus said, "You didn't have to come in person, you know." Frank just smiled. "It's not real to me until I put my hands on it." The site was a 1-acre farm plot on a property managed by a woman named Anita, who'd grown up there and refused to leave even when the power went out for 2 weeks straight last August. "If you boys can give me lights that don't go dark every time the wind sneezes, I'll name my next goat after you," she said, laughing as she led them around the property. Frank took his time. Walked the lines. Measured the distances. Talked through the install with Gus and Elise, sketching out the layout on a notepad like it was second nature. And in truth, it was. This was what he'd been meant to do. Build things. Solve problems. Light up dark places. Over the next 2 days, they installed the unit, ran the wiring, calibrated the solar panel outputs, and integrated the pocket grid with Tesla's software. There were hiccups, of course there were. A voltage spike on day 1. A cracked housing bracket that needed reinforcing. A firmware mismatch that delayed a data sync. But none of it fazed Frank. He moved through the setbacks like a conductor, adjusting, explaining, fixing. Not barking orders, not demanding credit, just steady. Ava came out on the 3rd day to see the site for herself. She watched the pocket grid deliver consistent current through a full cycle, watched the light stay on as clouds passed and power demand spiked. She nodded, arms crossed, impressed. "This is going to work," she said softly. "You know that, right?" Frank looked at her, then back at the system. "I hoped. Now I believe." She turned to him. We'd like to install 3 more units, 2 in Indiana, 1 in Iowa. Keep you involved in the development. Full partner status. You'd be compensated, of course. I don't care about the money, Frank said. I just want to see it help people. Ava smiled. That's exactly why we want you involved. That night, Frank stood on the edge of Anita's property and looked at the pocket grid humming beside the barn, its indicator lights glowing green against the fading dusk. There was something sacred about it, this small, quiet engine of hope born from 30 years of waiting, of doubting, of pushing through the darkness. He remembered the night he almost threw the plans away. The night the prototype shorted and he nearly gave up. And now, here it was. Not a dream. Not a relic. A solution. Anita came up beside him, arms folded, looking at the lights. Feels different, she said. Like we're not forgotten anymore. Frank nodded. You're not. She looked at him sideways. You really built this in your garage? He smiled. That's where most American revolutions start. She laughed. Well, if you ever want to open a factory, let me know. I've got some stubborn land and a barn full of junk you could probably turn into miracles. Frank chuckled, but her words stayed with him. A factory. A team. A movement. Why not? As he drove home that night, windows down, stars overhead, he thought about Linda, about the girl who used to hold his hand at county fairs and believe he could build anything. Maybe she'd been right all along. Maybe some fires never go out. They just wait for oxygen. And maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning. Frank Dalton woke to the glow of his tablet screen in the pre-dawn darkness, headlines staring back at him in bold type, retired electrician's garage-inspired battery design gets Tesla nod, pocket grid, local innovation sparks rural power revolution, 72-year-old inventor revives forgotten town with energy storage, and in that suspended haze between night and day, he realized he was no longer alone. A low hum began in his chest, the sound of attention gathering, of idea meeting audience, and he sat up slowly, the world suddenly a little louder, a little more urgent. The hush that once defined his days had been shattered by clicks and shares and local news camera lenses, and he felt the weight of it settling around his shoulders like static. He wasn't just tinkering in the dark anymore, he'd become the noise. He flicked through the articles, each one another echo in a widening corridor. A regional paper had traced his story back to the town's fading hardware store and quoted him. If you can still breathe, you can still build. His name was splashed in digital ink. Galleries of his setup appeared near the bottom, a blue tube light above a stained workbench, wires coiled carefully, a glowing LED powered by his prototype. He stared at it, and for a moment thought he recognized the man in the photo, gray-haired, weathered, but fierce in that soft way that comes from rekindled hope. The phone rang. To his shock, it was a local TV producer asking if they could come shoot a segment. Then there was the email from the county fair committee, asking if he might speak at the opening of the Harvest Festival. Even a college professor from Urbana-Champaign had written, asking if she could bring students to see the pocket grid in action. Frank blinked hard. All this attention felt like waves breaking on a shoreline that had been dry for years. It was thrilling. It was terrifying. He picked up the phone again, his daughter calling back after hours of texts. She sounded different this time, more steady, her voice not worried but excited. "Dad," she said, "I watched the news clip. You look alive." He pressed his lips together and nodded, though she couldn't see. "I feel alive," he said. Her laugh was soft. "Good." That afternoon, a crew came. 3 people with badges and cameras and a boom mic. They set up in the garage, lights beaming on the battery setup, shadows dancing on the walls. Frank stood in the center, old electrician's hands moving deliberately over the wiring as a young reporter asked him questions about his motivation, about dreams deferred and dreams recharged. "Are you surprised by all this attention?" she asked, the boom hovering above him like a hawk. Frank paused, chest fluttering. "I'm surprised it took so long," he said finally. That line belied the years of doubt and the nights filled with silence, but it also carried everything that didn't fit into a soundbite. The cameras rolled, the lights stayed hot, and Frank spoke, not just about circuits and innovation, but about memory and legacy. About how power wasn't only about electrons, it was about belief. When the segment ended, the crew filed out. Paperwork followed, interview confirmations, permissions, release forms. The quiet that followed felt thick, like a room holding its breath. Frank drifted into the house and looked around at the familiar rooms, the same, but altered by the knowledge that the world now carried a picture of him that wasn't faded. Upstairs, he found his daughter waiting. She held out a cup of coffee. "We should talk," she said. And so they did, about how she'd been distant out of worry, not distance, about how he'd waited too long to prove himself again, and how recognition now didn't change anything about who he was, but it changed how others saw him. He realized then that sometimes the noise isn't the danger, it's the signal. The next day, attention multiplied. Social media caught fire. Comments poured in, some from neighbors, others from strangers across the country. Proof that age is just a number. If my grandpa can build, so can you. Even a tweeted image of a similar prototype design in Texas landed in his notifications. Frank didn't log off. He sat and read. He laughed. He cried. He saw in those shared posts the faces of people who felt invisible, and maybe didn't anymore. But with noise comes pressure. He began waking at 3 a.m., mind buzzing not with battle plans, but with expectations. Could he keep this up? Could a man in his 70s manage not only invention but attention, collaboration, and, for the first time, public scrutiny? At the local diner, someone stopped him. "Hey, you're that pocket grid guy." The voice was kind but loud, a man at the counter snapped his fingers. "You lit up our town." Frank smiled and felt a flicker of pride, then swallowed hard. It wasn't easy to meet those eyes. At home, he found himself second-guessing every move. Should he post updates online? Should he accept more media invites? Should he scale up faster? He realized the noise had a gravitational pull, tugging him into decisions before he was ready. That night, he stepped into the garage, louder now from echoing lights and radio chatter left on for background. He touched the prototype and thought about possibility and pressure coiling like wires around his heart. He thought of Linda. The way we used to hold our dreams close until they caught fire. This one was catching. He closed the door gently and turned off the light. In the hush, he whispered to himself, one day at a time. The next morning, he set boundaries. He would do media, but not every day. He would post progress, but only when it felt like progress, otherwise, he'd keep working, quietly. He scheduled calls with Anita, Mason, Ava. He drew up a simple plan. Finish the Phase 1 field tests, then reassess. The noise would stay. There'd be more echoes. More questions. More people wanting a piece of this lightning. But he'd learned something in the dark: to matter is not the same as performing. Sometimes it's enough to show up, to rebuild, to hold the current steady, even when the world turns up the volume. He walked back into the garage, flicked on the bench light, and smiled at the small LED glowing steady and strong. That light didn't ask for attention. It just did its job. So would he. Frank Dalton woke to a world that felt both familiar and newly glorious, the garage with its humming pocket grid prototype casting long morning shadows like silent applause, the front yard lights still flickering from the rural field test overnight, the quiet hum of possibility wrapping around him like a warm blanket. He rubbed his eyes, gave a soft nod to the blinking LED array, and stepped outside into the crisp dawn air. At the edge of the driveway, he found his mailbox flooded with letters, handwritten thank yous from farm families waiting for consistent light, postcards with "We've got power" scrawled in bold letters, and even one from a schoolteacher in Indiana saying that her students had tearfully cheered when the lights stayed on during a storm. He didn't tell anyone about these, he just folded each envelope and tucked them into the notebook where the blueprints lived, the past and present coiled together. Ashamed and elated halfway through, he carried his coffee out back and watched the sun rise over the fields, as though lighting a stage where he was finally allowed to step into view. The rest of the day moved like a dream filtered through golden light, an email from Tesla with test data confirming system stability under harsh weather, a request for more units, a video call from a local news crew asking if they could run a feature headlined, "Pocket Grid, Small Town, Big Future." Through it all, Frank felt something he hadn't felt in years, confidence that didn't shout, but glowed steady, like a filament warmed by purpose. He strategized quietly, this was more than validation or attention. This was a chance to prove that a faded town and one old electrician could still mean something in a world chasing the next big thing. That afternoon, he walked across the road to the school, where the principal had invited him to speak at the evening assembly. In the school auditorium, dim projector lights flicked to life as Frank approached the stage, a man who once dreamt in shadows now stepping into real light. Students sat wide-eyed, some too young even to know what Tesla was, others holding phones, filming. He opened with a question he'd once asked himself, what if everything you believed about getting old was wrong? The silence that followed was alive. He spoke not about circuitry this time, but about memory and second chances, the power stored in a lifetime of quiet. He quoted Elon Musk, yes, but framed it for their world, if you can still breathe, you can still build. And if you can build, you can matter. He told them that sometimes, the greatest innovations aren't made in labs, they're made in dusty garages, in cities that forgot they existed, by people who stopped waiting for permission. The applause at the end felt like a tide washing over the auditorium. Afterward, kids swarmed him, asking if they could see the battery, if they too could build something, if they could bring solar panels from home to tinker with him in the garage. Their wonder reminded him of a younger version of himself, torch in hand, ready for sparks to fly. That night, back in his silent kitchen, Frank sat at the table and opened the notebook where the letters, the sketches, the hopes were kept together. He didn't brag. He just smiled, thinking, this glimmer, this light, was more than electricity. It was forgiveness. It was reconnection. It was proof that even the faintest spark can charge a life again. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank Dalton drove out early, the cab of his old pickup humming beneath him like a faithful companion, the cracked leather seat familiar against his back. Today, he was headed deeper into the heartland, to a place where power wasn't guaranteed and hope often flickered like a candle in a stiff breeze. Tesla's latest project had called for a test site, off the grid, literally, a small cluster of homes nestled near a stretch of dense woods, where electric lines stopped and diesel generators hummed in grudging defiance. Frank wasn't just delivering hardware this time. He was delivering faith. The rural community of Cedar Ridge was a scattering of farms and cabins, the kind of place where neighbors still waved from porches and stories were told around bonfires that smelled of pine and smoke. The sun was just climbing when Frank pulled up to the first homestead, an aging ranch house painted faded white with chipped shutters and a porch swing that creaked in the morning wind. A woman with wind-roughened cheeks and determined eyes came to the door, introducing herself as Mary Ellen, a widow who'd lived on the land her whole life. She'd been skeptical of outside solutions, relying on her old generator and the occasional solar panel rigged on the roof. "We've been through blackouts that lasted days, weeks even," she said, voice steady but edged with exhaustion. "Sometimes you start to think the power company's forgotten us." Frank nodded, sensing the weariness beneath her words, the loneliness that came with isolation, the frustration of watching neighbors live in light while she measured candles by the hour. He told her about the pocket grid, explained how it could store power from solar panels, wind turbines, or the grid itself, releasing energy steadily when the sun went down or the wind died. "It's about giving control back," he said, about making sure you don't have to wait for someone else to decide when you get light. She looked at him thoughtfully, then nodded. All right, Frank. Let's see what you've got. Over the next 2 days, Frank and Tesla's engineers worked side by side, stringing wires, installing battery modules, calibrating systems. The air smelled of pine and earth and something else, hope. There were challenges. Trees blocked some solar exposure. The rugged terrain tested wiring durability. Yet every obstacle was met with quiet determination. Frank moved among the crew with the ease of a man who'd built his life around fixing things. At night, around the campfire, Mary Ellen told stories of the land, of winters that took power and spirits alike, of a community holding on despite it all. Frank listened, feeling the thread that tied innovation to humanity. When the first test cycle began, the whole neighborhood gathered on the porch, holding hands and holding breath as the grid kicked on. The hum was gentle, almost reverent, as lights glowed in windows that had long known darkness. Cheers rose in the air, mingling with the scent of pine and firewood, and Frank realized this was more than a project, it was a lifeline. Over the following weeks, Frank stayed in contact, tweaking the system remotely, hearing reports of fewer outages, more comfort, even neighbors teaching one another how to manage their energy use more wisely. The pocket grid wasn't just technology. It was a bridge, a way to reconnect isolated people with their power and each other. Back home, Frank felt the weight of success but also a deep hum of responsibility. This work was far from done. He sat at his kitchen table late one night, staring at an old photo of Linda and himself at the county fair, hands clasped and dreams wide open. The glimmer of possibility he'd found wasn't just about light, it was about legacy. He whispered into the quiet, "This one's for you." And somewhere deep inside, he felt her answer, soft, steady, forever. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over Frank's garage as he stared at the ledger of orders, emails, and messages piling up on his tablet. His heart raced beneath the steady beat of his aging pulse, a mix of exhilaration and doubt twisting inside him like tangled wires. On one hand, the pocket grid was catching fire, communities reaching out, invitations to speak, offers to partner from companies he'd never imagined talking to. On the other, the weight of expectations pressed against him like a storm cloud ready to burst. He closed the tablet, rubbed his hands over his face, and sighed. Was he ready for this? Could a man who'd spent years in the background suddenly lead the charge of a small revolution? His daughter Ava's words echoed from their last call, "Dad, people want to believe in you. But you have to believe in yourself first." How easy it was to forget that simple truth. That night, Frank walked the quiet streets of his town, the familiar creaks of porches and rustling leaves whispering stories of years past. Passing a bench by the old church, he sat, and the cool wooden planks creaked beneath him. He thought about Linda, how she always believed he could do more, even when he didn't believe it himself. That memory stirred a knot of regret and longing. He pulled out his phone and watched a clip of Elon Musk, speaking at a conference, challenging the world to push the boundaries of what's possible. The words lit a slow-burning ember inside him. It wasn't just about batteries or technology, it was about refusing to be defined by age or circumstance. The crossroads lay ahead, continue cautiously, letting the noise and attention overwhelm him, or step boldly into the unknown, owning his story and his future. The next day, Frank sat down with his closest friends, men and women who knew him as the electrician who'd fixed the town's broken wiring for decades, not the rising star of energy innovation. Their skepticism was gentle but real. "Frank," one said, "we're proud. But you've got to be careful. This kind of spotlight, it can burn you up." Another shook her head. "What happens if this all fades? What then?" Their concerns echoed the fear that gnawed at Frank's gut. Failure was not just personal. It felt like letting down an entire town, an entire generation. He thought about the small victories, the glowing windows in Cedar Ridge, the children's cheers at the school assembly. He thought about Linda's steady hands, his daughter's hopeful voice. And then he made a choice. "I'm going to take the next step," he said quietly, but with conviction. "Not just making batteries, but building a community around them. Teaching people. Sharing what I've learned." His friends exchanged looks, some worried, others nodding slowly. "We'll be with you," one said finally. "Every step." The decision sparked a shift. Frank reached out to local colleges, proposing workshops where students could build simple energy storage systems. He coordinated with community centers, organizing events where neighbors could share solar panels, swap tools, and learn together. He opened a small blog, where he posted updates, honest, raw, sometimes stumbling, but always forward. Each step felt like a brick laid in a foundation he hadn't dared to imagine before. But progress was never without resistance. One morning, a call came from a Tesla executive, polite, professional, but clear. "Frank, we love what you're doing, but you need to focus. We can't have distractions. It's either partnership or the open market." The ultimatum stung like a slap. Was he ready to give up the independence he cherished? To bend under corporate weight? Or risk losing a lifeline he'd barely grasped? That night, Frank sat alone, the garage light casting long shadows over the blueprints. He felt the weight of choices stretching before him like an impossible map. Somewhere between the noise and the silence, between legacy and reinvention, he knew he had to find his own path. He remembered a phrase Elon had once said: "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." That night, Frank whispered to the darkness, "I'm going to do it my way." And with that, a quiet resolve settled over him, a promise to himself that no matter the crossroads, he would walk forward with his heart and hands open wide. The morning sun filtered through dusty blinds, casting soft beams across Frank Dalton's cluttered workbench where sketches, wires, and half-finished prototypes rested in quiet anticipation. Today was different. Not just another day in the garage, but the day of the first community workshop, a chance to light a new spark beyond his own small world. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged the tiny battery modules, each one a symbol of hope and persistence, a thread weaving together decades of quiet labor. The little LED on the test unit blinked steadily, a heartbeat in the dim room. Word had spread, faster than he'd imagined, and now, faces he'd never met would gather in the old community center to learn, to build, to dream alongside him. Frank thought of Linda's hands, steady and sure, guiding his younger ones when he was just a boy, learning the craft that had carried him through life's storms. If she were here, she'd smile that warm, knowing smile and say, "It only takes one spark to start a fire." The hall filled with the murmurs of curious voices as people filtered in, farmers, retirees, teenagers clutching notebooks, a handful of city folks looking for a new kind of connection. Frank's heart swelled with a mix of nerves and determination. He greeted them with a nod and began the session by sharing his story, not just the technical details, but the long, winding path that led him here. He talked about age and doubt and the power of perseverance. He quoted Elon Musk's fearless defiance of limits, not as a legend, but as an invitation. If you can still breathe, you can still build. The crowd listened, some with skepticism, others with sparks of recognition flickering in their eyes. When he moved into the hands-on portion, guiding them to assemble simple battery packs, the room buzzed with quiet energy. Questions flew, about wiring, safety, potential, and Frank answered each with patient clarity. At one point, a young woman named Marcy, a high school senior with dreams of engineering, raised her hand. "Mr. Dalton, how do you keep going when it feels like the world's moving too fast?" Frank smiled, looking at her bright, eager eyes. "You don't have to keep pace with the world. You just have to keep moving. One step. One wire. One spark at a time." As the hours passed, the energy in the room shifted from cautious curiosity to shared purpose. The air was thick with hope and the hum of connection, as strangers worked side by side, bridging generations and experiences. Frank noticed Ava among the crowd, standing quietly at the back, pride softening her usually sharp gaze. The workshop ended with applause, handshakes, and promises to return. Frank felt something he hadn't in years: belonging. That night, alone in the garage, he traced his fingers over the glowing LED once more, feeling its warmth seep into his bones. A message pinged on his phone. A local news crew wanted to feature the workshop, eager to capture the spirit of renewal sweeping through the town. The spotlight was back, but this time, Frank felt ready. Ready not just to shine, but to illuminate a path for others. As he prepared for the next day, Frank whispered to himself, "This is just the beginning." The fire was no longer a flicker in the dark. It was a blaze, fueled by community, courage, and the simple, unyielding truth that no one is ever too old to start again. The momentum Frank Dalton had only dared imagine now carried him forward like a steady current, unstoppable and surging with purpose. The success of the first workshop rippled outward, sparking invitations from nearby towns, local governments, and environmental groups eager to embrace the promise of the pocket grid. Frank's days blurred into a whirlwind of travel, teaching, and hands-on building, but through it all, the garage remained his sanctuary, a place where dreams were soldered into reality, and where age was just a number fading beneath layers of grit and determination. Driving down the winding roads between townships, Frank often caught himself staring at the horizon, the golden field stretching endlessly, the wind whispering secrets of change through the tall grass. Each new community he visited was a fresh canvas, a chance to connect with people who, like him, felt forgotten by time but were hungry to reclaim their power, literally and metaphorically. One afternoon in Greenville, a small farming community wrestling with energy scarcity, Frank met Jacob, a retired mechanic whose hands bore the scars of decades of labor but whose eyes held the same fierce spark Frank saw in his own reflection. Jacob had tried solar before but gave up when the systems failed and repairs became too costly. "I figured it was easier to just endure the blackouts," Jacob admitted over coffee. Frank shook his head. "Endurance is strength, but it's not the end of the story. What we're building is about resilience, a grid that fights back, that puts power in your hands." Together, they spent the day installing a battery unit on Jacob's workshop roof, the two men moving with the easy rhythm of shared craft and respect. When the lights flickered on that evening, illuminating the once dark windows with steady, warm glow, Jacob clasped Frank's shoulder. "You've given us more than light. You've given us hope." It was moments like these that erased years of doubt and fatigue, moments that reminded Frank why he refused to give up. But the growing attention brought new challenges. Media crews followed his every step, eager to capture the miracle man who had reinvented himself and a small town's future. Corporate pressures mounted as Tesla pushed for exclusivity, while competitors eyed the market with hungry eyes. Frank felt the strain of balancing progress and integrity, of navigating the murky waters between innovation and commercialization. One evening, after a long day of talks and installations, Frank sat alone in a hotel room, the silence a stark contrast to the chaos of the day. He scrolled through comments on his blog, messages of encouragement, questions, and stories from others inspired by his journey. A sudden video message popped up, from a woman named Linda from Vermont, who shared how she'd started her own community grid after watching Frank's workshops online. Tears welled up in his eyes as he realized the reach of the spark he'd ignited. Not just local, not just regional, this was becoming a movement. A phone call from Ava broke through his reverie. "Dad, you need to come home," she said gently. "Mom's old friends want to celebrate your success at the community center. It's time to remember where this all began." Returning home felt like closing a circle. The familiar streets, the weathered faces of neighbors, the creak of the porch swing, they were all part of his story, part of the legacy he was building. At the gathering, voices rose in laughter and tears, sharing memories of old and hopes for new. Frank spoke again, but this time with a softer voice, full of gratitude and humility. "I never imagined this journey would lead here," he said. "But I've learned that momentum isn't just about speed or success. It's about carrying each other forward, hand in hand." As the evening drew to a close, Frank stood on the porch, looking up at the stars blinking in the clear night sky. Somewhere in the distance, a generator's hum had been replaced by the steady pulse of batteries humming in homes that once knew darkness. The road ahead was still long, full of unknowns and challenges, but for the first time in years, Frank felt the future wasn't just something to endure, it was something to build. He smiled, thinking of Elon's words again, when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. And in that moment, against the backdrop of a small town shining with new light, Frank knew he had already won. Frank Dalton had learned that every revolution carried its shadow, a resistance lurking in the corners, ready to test resolve and shake belief to its core. Just as the pocket grid had begun to light up communities from one end of the state to the other, murmurs of opposition grew louder. Local utilities, threatened by the decentralized power model Frank championed, began lobbying against the initiative, painting it as risky and unproven. News headlines questioned the safety of home-built battery systems. In town halls, officials warned citizens against unregulated energy projects. The old fears Frank carried, the doubts whispered by doctors, the skeptical glances from neighbors, came rushing back with a vengeance. The day it hit hardest was a bleak Tuesday. Frank was preparing for a panel discussion at the state energy conference when his phone buzzed with an urgent email. A formal complaint had been filed by a powerful utility company, accusing his project of endangering public safety and violating regulations. The news spread like wildfire, igniting fear among the very communities he had helped empower. He sat at his kitchen table, the familiar hum of the garage behind him replaced by an eerie silence. The weight of responsibility crushed his chest. Was he risking everything he had built? Was this the end? The next morning, Frank faced a storm of calls and messages. Friends and supporters rallied to his side, but the critics were loud and unforgiving. At the local coffee shop, once a place of casual camaraderie, he was met with cold stares and whispered warnings. "You're playing with fire, Frank," said a former client. "These batteries aren't safe." The words stung, not just because of their doubt, but because they echoed his own fears. That night, he sat in the garage, hands trembling over a tangle of wires. The battery modules blinked softly, steady but fragile in the dark. He thought of Elon Musk's infamous risks, Tesla's fiery setbacks, SpaceX's early failures, and the fearless mindset that refused to quit. "If something's important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor," Musk had said. Frank clung to those words like a lifeline. The battle was no longer just about technology, it was about trust, about fighting to keep a future that many had written off as impossible. He decided to meet the challenge head-on. Frank organized a community forum, inviting skeptics, supporters, regulators, and experts to come together in the town hall. The night was tense, filled with heated debates and raw emotion. Utility representatives warned of dangers and legal complications, community members shared stories of blackout hardships and newfound hope. Frank stood before the crowd, his voice steady but passionate. "This isn't just about batteries or technology. It's about giving power back to the people who've been left in the dark for too long." He demonstrated the safety protocols, shared transparent test results, and invited questions without hesitation. Slowly, the tide began to turn. One by one, voices softened. Some skeptics asked how they could be involved in improving safety. Regulators proposed pilot programs to oversee expansion. The resistance didn't disappear, but it no longer loomed like an insurmountable wall. In the weeks that followed, Frank doubled down on education and transparency, launching a series of workshops focused on safety, maintenance, and innovation. His blog became a platform for open dialogue, for sharing fears and hopes alike. Ava stood by him, helping coordinate events and manage growing media attention. The fight tested every fiber of Frank's being, his patience, his faith, his resolve, but also revealed a new strength born of vulnerability. One evening, exhausted but resolute, Frank sat by the window watching the stars emerge. A message from Mary Ellen in Cedar Ridge lit up his phone. "We believe in you, Frank. Keep shining." The simple words wrapped around his heart, reminding him that every light cast a shadow, but also that shadows could be overcome. Frank smiled, feeling the quiet hum of the pocket grid pulsing beneath his feet, a defiant beacon in a world too often content with darkness. He whispered into the night, "We're not done yet." The early morning light spilled through the cracked window of Frank Dalton's garage, bathing the cluttered workspace in a warm glow that felt like a promise. After weeks of battles, both external and internal, the storm was beginning to clear. Frank rubbed his tired eyes and turned back to the blueprint spread across the workbench. This was it, the next evolution of the pocket grid, a more efficient, safer, and affordable battery design that could finally tip the balance in their favor. The breakthrough wasn't just technical, it was personal. Each carefully measured component represented years of hope, frustration, and relentless perseverance. Ava stood nearby, her face illuminated by the soft glow of her laptop screen, monitoring energy output data from recent prototypes. "Dad," she said quietly, "the efficiency is better than anything we've seen before. This could change everything." Frank nodded, the weight of responsibility settling comfortably on his shoulders. The months of resistance, the long nights of doubt, the heated town halls, they all converged here, in this moment of possibility. That afternoon, Frank gathered his team, a mix of volunteers, engineers, and community members, in the community center. He stood before them and spoke with a voice steady but charged with emotion. "This breakthrough is more than just a new battery. It's proof that change is possible when we refuse to give up. When we believe in each other and ourselves." The room erupted in applause, but Frank's mind raced ahead. The real challenge was yet to come, scaling up production, navigating regulations, and convincing the skeptics who still clung to fear. He remembered Elon Musk's relentless drive to iterate, to learn from failure, to push through barriers that seemed insurmountable. Frank knew he had to embody that same spirit. Over the next few weeks, the new design underwent rigorous testing. Every success was celebrated, every failure dissected and learned from. The team worked late into the nights, fueled by coffee, determination, and the vision of a brighter future. One evening, as Frank calibrated a battery module, his phone buzzed with a message from a news producer. A national network wanted to feature the pocket grid story, shining a light on grassroots innovation. The opportunity was both exhilarating and terrifying. Public exposure meant scrutiny, but also a chance to amplify the message beyond the borders of their small towns. Frank called Ava, and together they prepared, crafting the story not as a tale of individual heroism, but as a shared journey, a testament to resilience, community, and the refusal to accept limitations. The day of the broadcast arrived, and as the camera's red light blinked on, Frank felt the familiar pulse of nerves mixed with hope. He spoke honestly about his fears and failures, about the doubts whispered by age and society, and about the power of a spark, one small idea that could ignite a revolution. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Messages flooded in from across the country, stories from people who felt inspired, who saw themselves in Frank's journey, who wanted to join the movement. Local governments requested workshops, universities invited collaboration, energy advocates sought partnerships. The breakthrough was no longer confined to batteries and circuits, it was a breakthrough of belief, a validation that transformation is possible at any stage of life. Yet, amidst the excitement, Frank remained grounded. He understood that true change required patience and perseverance, not fleeting fame. In the quiet moments back in the garage, he reflected on the path that had brought him here, the crossroads, the resistance, the small victories, and realized something profound. This wasn't just about power in the electrical sense. It was about power reclaimed, the power to choose, to create, to matter. As he looked up at the framed photo of Linda on the workbench, he whispered, "We did it, Linda. We're just getting started." Outside, the pocket grid hummed softly, a steady pulse of light and hope in a world hungry for both. Frank Dalton stood at a crossroads, not just the literal intersection of Main Street and Pine Avenue in his hometown, but a momentous juncture in his life's journey. The glow from the pocket grid systems lit up the neighborhood windows, a quiet testament to how far they'd come. Yet, beneath the surface of success simmered questions that gnawed at him deep into the night. Was this the path he truly wanted? Could he sustain the growing momentum without losing himself? The press had started calling him a local hero, an accidental visionary, but Frank felt far from a hero. He was tired. The months of travel, negotiations, and public appearances wore on his spirit. Ava noticed it too, the way he'd sometimes retreat into silence, the way his smile carried a shadow. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rolling hills, Ava found him sitting on the porch, staring at the horizon. "Dad," she said softly, "you've built something incredible, but what do you want from this?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the humid summer breeze. Frank sighed, fingers tracing the weathered wood beneath him. "I thought I wanted to prove that age isn't a barrier, that a second act is possible. But lately, I'm wondering if I'm chasing something else. Recognition? Purpose? Or just, meaning?" Ava sat beside him, her hand finding his. "Maybe all of that. But meaning comes from more than what we build, it comes from who we become along the way." That night, Frank dreamt of Linda, her smile radiant as ever, her voice steady and kind. She told him that the journey was never about the destination, but the courage to keep walking when the path is uncertain. When he woke, the clarity was undeniable. Frank realized the next step wasn't just about expanding the pocket grid or battling opponents, it was about choosing his own future, on his own terms. The following days were filled with difficult conversations. Some partners wanted to scale rapidly, seeking investors and larger markets. Others urged caution, fearing the loss of community focus. Frank weighed every option, feeling the tension between growth and authenticity. He thought back to Elon Musk's relentless pursuit of innovation paired with his own humanity. Musk never stopped pushing boundaries but also embraced failure as part of progress. Frank decided that whatever came next had to honor the spirit that started it all, the spark of possibility, the refusal to fade quietly into obscurity. One afternoon, as he walked through the town's new community garden, powered by the pocket grid, Frank met Marcy, now a budding engineer and one of his first workshop attendees. She grinned brightly. "You know, I'm starting a renewable energy club at school. I want to help spread what you taught us." Frank's heart swelled with pride. "That's exactly why we do this." Their conversation sparked a new idea. What if the movement wasn't just about batteries and technology, but about empowering the next generation? About planting seeds that would grow long after he was gone. Frank began drafting plans for an education program, reaching out to schools and youth centers. He imagined workshops led by young people, mentorships, and community projects. The vision rekindled his energy, filling the space where doubt had taken root. But with renewal came difficult choices. One evening, a lucrative offer arrived from a tech conglomerate seeking to acquire the pocket grid technology in exchange for resources to mass-produce and market it globally. The offer promised fame, financial security, and the chance to impact millions, but at the cost of relinquishing control. Frank sat with Ava, the weight of the decision pressing down. If we sell, this becomes a product. But if we don't, it stays a movement, messy, slow, but ours. Ava nodded. "There's no right answer, Dad. Only the one you can live with." For days, Frank wrestled with the dilemma. He remembered the long nights in this very garage, the dreams that first ignited here, the community that had rallied together when hope seemed thin. Finally, he reached a decision. He declined the offer. Instead, he chose to grow the network slowly, deliberately, staying true to the grassroots heart of the project. The choice was both freeing and daunting, a testament to the power of purpose over profit. As Frank watched another evening settle over the town, the soft glow of pocket grid lights twinkling like stars below, he felt a quiet peace. The crossroads had been daunting, but it had also opened a new chapter. One where he wasn't just building energy solutions but building legacy, connection, and meaning. With Ava by his side, Frank knew that whatever came next, the spark would never die. The first light of dawn broke over the small town like a promise whispered on the breeze. Frank Dalton stood at the edge of the community center parking lot, a fresh breeze tugging at the collar of his worn jacket. Today was the day the pilot program for the Youth Renewable Energy Initiative would launch, the program Frank had dreamed of since that quiet conversation with Marcy in the garden. The air was thick with possibility, the hum of anticipation buzzing beneath the surface as students, teachers, and community members gathered around. Ava, energetic and radiant, flitted between groups, coordinating last-minute details with a grace that made Frank proud. Watching her, he marveled at how much had changed, and yet, how much remained the same. The spark was no longer his alone. It belonged to a generation eager to carry the torch forward. As the sun climbed higher, Frank took the stage, his voice steady but infused with emotion. "This program isn't just about technology or batteries," he said. "It's about hope. It's about showing every one of you that your ideas matter, that you can make a difference, no matter your age, your background, or the doubts the world might whisper in your ear." The crowd erupted into applause, but Frank's eyes found Marcy in the front row, her face alight with determination. The day unfolded with workshops, hands-on experiments, and discussions that crackled with energy. Frank moved through the crowd like a proud father, offering encouragement and sharing stories of setbacks and breakthroughs. The students' enthusiasm was contagious, igniting a new kind of fire inside him. Later, as the last group packed up, a quiet voice interrupted the buzz. "Mr. Dalton." A young woman stepped forward, her hair tied back in a loose bun, eyes sharp with curiosity. "I'm Rachel. I'm a researcher at the State University. I've been following your work, and I think there's a way we can collaborate to improve the battery design even further." Frank's heart leapt. Collaboration with academia was a crucial step toward sustainability and credibility. "Let's talk," he said simply, already imagining the possibilities. Over the next weeks, partnerships blossomed. Frank found himself in labs and lecture halls, surrounded by minds as hungry for innovation as his own. Together, they refined the pocket grid technology, making it safer, more efficient, and adaptable to diverse environments. The work was challenging, often exhausting, but Frank felt younger with each breakthrough. The resistance that had once felt like an immovable mountain now seemed more like a series of hurdles, each one a chance to prove their resolve. One afternoon, Ava and Frank stood overlooking the solar farm they'd helped develop on the outskirts of town. The panels stretched like a shimmering sea beneath the golden sun, feeding energy into the community grid. "We're creating a future that's brighter than I ever imagined," Ava said softly. Frank nodded. "It's more than just light. It's freedom. It's a new way of living." But even as hope grew, challenges remained. The energy conglomerates fought back with renewed vigor, flooding regulatory agencies with objections and lobbying for stricter rules that threatened to stifle grassroots innovation. Frank felt the sting of setbacks, but also the steady pulse of community support. The people who had once doubted were now advocates, their voices rising in unison. One evening, Frank received a call from a nearby town struck by a devastating storm. The power grid was down, and the community was struggling. The pocket grid systems, installed just months before, had kept critical facilities running. "Your work saved lives," the mayor told Frank, voice thick with gratitude. That moment crystallized everything. The technology was no longer just an experiment, it was a lifeline. Frank realized that the true revolution wasn't just in the batteries or the power stored within them, it was in the resilience they fostered. The next morning, as Frank walked through the town streets, he noticed something new. Children played under streetlights powered by the grid. Local businesses buzzed with energy, and neighbors gathered in porches glowing warmly with light. The invisible network that Frank had helped build pulsed with life and possibility. At home, as Frank and Ava sat on the porch swing, the night sky sprawling above, he reflected on how far they had come. The journey had tested his body and spirit, challenged every belief he held about aging, purpose, and possibility. Yet here they were. Proof that reinvention was possible at any age, that hope could be engineered and nurtured like a seedling growing toward the sun. Elon Musk's words echoed softly in Frank's mind: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Frank smiled, feeling the quiet power of those words settle into his bones. They weren't just about rockets or batteries, they were about life. About fighting for what mattered, no matter the odds. The horizon stretched wide and inviting, a canvas waiting to be filled with new stories, new challenges, and new victories. And Frank Dalton was ready to keep walking forward, one spark at a time. Frank Dalton awoke to the soft hum of the pocket grid beneath his home, a familiar pulse that had become both soundtrack and lifeblood over the past year. Today was different though, a day heavy with meaning. The education program had grown beyond his wildest hopes, the community's embrace of clean energy shifting from novelty to necessity. But Frank knew the true test was in ensuring the spark he had ignited would endure long after he was gone. Ava burst into the kitchen, a stack of freshly printed pamphlets clutched in her hands. "Dad, the first batch of Legacy in Motion kits arrived. The schools are ready." The program, a comprehensive curriculum combined with hands-on battery building kits, was designed to empower young minds across the region. Frank smiled, the weight of years pressing lighter for a moment. This was more than a project, it was a movement, a legacy. Driving to the local middle school, Frank watched as students buzzed with excitement, assembling battery cells, connecting wires, and testing circuits with wide-eyed wonder. The classroom was alive with possibility, a stark contrast to the silent fear that had once haunted him in those lonely nights of doubt. During a break, Frank sat with Marcy, now a confident mentor leading the program. "It's incredible to see how far we've come," she said, her eyes shining. "You showed us that age isn't a barrier, just a number. That's something we're going to carry with us." Frank nodded, feeling a surge of pride and humility. The journey had transformed him as much as it had the community. Yet, despite progress, obstacles remained. The energy conglomerate's lobbying efforts intensified, new regulations threatened to choke innovation, and some towns resisted change, clinging to the familiar even as the future beckoned. Frank found himself in heated debates, public hearings, and strategy sessions that tested his patience and resolve. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling meeting, Ava found him on the porch, staring at the fading light. "Dad, we're making a difference. Don't lose sight of that." Her words grounded him. He realized that legacy wasn't about perfection or final victories, it was about persistence, about showing up even when the road was hard. Inspired, Frank launched a campaign, Legacy in Motion, to amplify stories of ordinary people using the pocket grid to reclaim their power. Videos, testimonials, and community events spread hope and resilience like wildfire. Stories poured in, a retired teacher lighting her home for the first time in years, a small clinic in a rural town keeping its freezers running during outages, a single mother powering her small business with dignity. Each story was a thread weaving a tapestry of change. One evening, Frank received a letter in the mail, yellowed and worn at the edges. It was from a woman named Evelyn, a former engineer who had followed his journey from afar. She wrote of her own regrets, dreams shelved by doubt and circumstance, and how Frank's story had rekindled her passion. "You reminded me that it's never too late," she wrote. The letter struck a chord deep within Frank. The true measure of his legacy wasn't just the batteries or the technology, it was the lives touched, the courage awakened, the hope restored. As the seasons shifted, Frank found solace in quiet moments, tending to the garden Linda had planted years ago, sharing meals with Ava, watching the sunset paint the sky with hues of gold and purple. In those moments, he felt the weight of time less as a burden and more as a gift, a canvas on which to paint his final masterpiece. One crisp autumn evening, Frank stood at the edge of the town square, now lit entirely by the pocket grid's gentle glow. The community had gathered for a celebration, a testament to resilience and renewal. As the mayor spoke, praising Frank's vision and the collective spirit that had made it possible. Frank's eyes sought Ava's among the crowd. She smiled, a silent promise that the work would continue. Later, as the crowd dispersed and the night grew quiet, Frank lingered beneath the stars, whispering a vow to Linda's memory and to all who had believed in him. This is only the beginning. He knew the path ahead would hold new challenges, but he also knew that the spark, once ignited, could never be extinguished. Legacy, he realized, was not a fixed moment but a motion, a ripple that spreads far beyond a single life. And with that, Frank Dalton stepped forward into the night, carrying the light that would guide generations yet to come. The crisp morning air carried a tension unlike any Frank Dalton had felt before. Today wasn't just another step forward. It was the moment everything they'd built would be put to the ultimate test. Word had spread fast. The state government was launching a comprehensive review of the pocket grid's safety, efficiency, and potential risks. If it failed, years of work, hope, and hard-won progress could be erased in an instant. Frank stood in the cold lobby of the state's Energy Commission building, his breath visible in the air, heart pounding with the weight of the moment. He glanced at Ava beside him, her calm confidence a steady anchor amid the storm. The team had prepared meticulously, armed with data, testimonials, and unwavering belief. But Frank knew that belief alone wasn't enough. They had to face a panel of experts skeptical of grassroots innovation and protective of entrenched interests. As the hearing began, Frank felt the familiar sting of old fears, being dismissed, being too old, being overlooked. But then he remembered the words that had carried him through so many battles: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Elon Musk's voice echoed in his mind like a rallying cry. The testimony unfolded with precision, engineers detailed the innovations, community leaders spoke of lives changed, and Ava shared the story of the youth education program that had blossomed into a regional movement. When it was Frank's turn to speak, he took a deep breath and looked directly at the panel. This isn't just about batteries or technology. It's about people who have been told they're too old, too small, too insignificant to change the world. I'm here to prove that's not true. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Questions came sharp and probing, concerns about scalability, safety, environmental impact. Frank answered with honesty, humility, and a resolve forged in years of struggle. Hours passed like a blur. When the hearing finally adjourned, Frank and Ava stepped outside into the late afternoon sun, exhaustion heavy but tempered by a fragile hope. The wait for the commission's decision stretched over the next tense days. Each morning, Frank checked his phone, eyes scanning headlines for any sign of judgment. Then came the call. The lead commissioner's voice was steady but warm. "Mr. Dalton, after thorough review, we are approving the pocket grid for statewide deployment." The words hit Frank like a thunderclap. Tears welled up, a release of years of struggle, fear, and perseverance. The community had won. The movement had won. But more than that, Frank had won a battle against the doubts that had shadowed his every step. That evening, the town gathered for a celebration unlike any before. Lanterns floated into the night sky, each one a symbol of light overcoming darkness. Frank looked around at the faces, young and old, familiar and new, and felt a profound connection. This was more than a victory. It was a legacy in motion, a proof that transformation was possible at any age. In the quiet that followed, Ava took Frank's hand. "Dad, you did it. You showed them all." Frank squeezed her hand, voice thick with emotion. "No, we did it. Together." As the stars glittered overhead, Frank allowed himself a moment to dream again. The journey hadn't ended, it was only just beginning. But now, the fire inside him burned brighter than ever, fueled by the certainty that purpose and passion could defy even the fiercest odds. Elon Musk's relentless spirit had been a spark, but Frank's own heart had become the flame. And that flame would light the way forward for all who dared to believe in the impossible. The morning sun painted the hills in gold as Frank Dalton stepped outside with a mug of black coffee in his hand, the steam rising like a quiet benediction. The town around him hummed, not with the buzz of traffic or the clatter of machines, but with the subtle, persistent energy of something living, growing. Pocket grid systems now powered nearly every home in town, their quiet efficiency woven into the very rhythm of life. But more than that, something deeper had changed, something in the people. They stood taller, smiled more easily, spoke with hope instead of resignation. And Frank had changed too. At 73, his back was stiffer, his hands slower, but his heart beat with a steady, powerful sense of purpose. He no longer woke with the gnawing question, what's the point? Now, each morning arrived like a clean page, and he filled it with action. Whether it was mentoring young inventors, visiting community sites, or simply writing on his blog, he moved forward, not as a man running from age, but as one stepping fully into his second act. Ava pulled into the driveway and stepped out of her car, a familiar, grounding presence. "You ready?" she asked, holding up a bundle of papers. "Your keynote at the National Energy Conference is in 2 days. Thought we'd go over the final notes." Frank chuckled and took a sip of coffee. "Never thought I'd be keynoting anything at this age. I was supposed to be slowing down, remember?" Ava sat beside him on the porch steps. "You're not slowing down, Dad. You're shifting gears." That evening, Frank sat in his garage, the place where it all began. The original prototype of the pocket grid sat on a shelf like an old friend. He ran his fingers along its edges. It was rough, imperfect, barely held together by bolts, tape, and dreams. But it had worked. It had mattered. He thought about Elon Musk again, not as the billionaire icon, but as the relentless thinker who dared to question everything. Musk hadn't given Frank a step-by-step manual, he had given him something far more powerful, permission. Permission to ask what if. At an age when most people were asking what's left. Frank booted up his blog for what he suspected might be his final post. He stared at the blinking cursor, letting the silence gather around him. Then he began to type. "They told me I was too old to start over. That innovation belonged to the young. That relevance had a shelf life. I believed them for a while. I let the years bury the fire. But then I remembered something, I'm not here to fade, I'm here to finish." My second act began with a single quote, one spark, one impossible idea. What if a garage-built battery could give power back to the people? What if my life wasn't winding down, but waiting to become something more? I was never too old. I was just waiting for permission to matter again. You don't need the world's approval to change your life. You need your own courage. So whatever age you are, whatever regrets you carry, let this be your spark. The future doesn't belong to the young. It belongs to the brave. He hit publish. And for the first time in a long while, he felt something profound. Closure, not an end, but a completion. A moment that tied every failure, every risk, every triumph into something beautiful and whole. 2 days later, Frank stood behind the podium at the National Clean Energy Summit. The room was packed, engineers, policymakers, students, media. His story had spread far beyond state lines, and now people wanted to hear directly from the man who had dared to rebuild his life in a garage. He scanned the crowd and spotted Marcy in the front row, now interning at a leading renewable energy firm. He saw teachers, young students, a few government officials. And in the back, Ava gave him a quiet thumbs up. Frank leaned into the microphone, his voice calm, steady, and clear. "I used to think aging meant disappearing," he began. "But it doesn't. Aging means building differently. Not faster, not louder, but deeper. I didn't become less of a man when my body slowed down. I became more of one when I decided to try again anyway." He paused, letting the words settle. The pocket grid was never about wires and power storage. It was about people. About proving that one small spark can light 1,000 homes, and one brave choice can reignite a life. The standing ovation hit him like a wave. But he didn't bask in it. He bowed his head gently, then walked off stage with the quiet dignity of a man who had finally become whole. A few weeks later, Frank stood at Linda's gravesite, the autumn leaves falling in slow spirals. He knelt, pressing his hand to the cool stone. "I kept going, Linda," he whispered. "You'd be proud." He laid a small photograph on the ground, him and Ava standing beside a row of students holding up their first battery kits. He stood up, slowly, and looked out at the horizon. The future wasn't just coming. It was already here. And Frank Dalton had helped build it. Back in town, another pocket grid was being installed, this one by a team of high school students who barely remembered life without it. As they worked, they laughed and joked, unaware of the man who started it all, quietly walking past, tipping his hat. Frank didn't need a statue. He didn't need his name in textbooks. His legacy pulsed through the wires of 1,000 homes, lived in the hands of the next generation, and burned in the hearts of anyone who had ever felt left behind. And somewhere out there, in a world still racing toward the next big thing, an aging dreamer heard Frank's story, looked at their empty garage, and whispered, "Maybe it's not too late." And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?